course. So, hello, we've already introduced ourselves, but I'm Maddie.
I'm Sarah.
Hi, Maddie and Sarah.
And then your name is?
My name is Kenneth C. Davis.
Can you tell us why you're here today? Because you were the speaker this morning, right?
I was the speaker this morning, and most people know me because I wrote a series of books that all begin with the words "Don't know much about." The first one was "Don't know much about history," everything you need to know about American history but never learned. And that book came out a little more than 20 years ago, and I've spent the last 20 years writing and talking about history to teachers and other people around the country. And my books are not really written for school. They're not textbooks. They're not for schools, but a lot of teachers have used them over the years because I try and make history a lot more interesting than it was for most of us in school.
So, 20 years ago, when you decided you were going to write the book, what was why did you decide you wanted to write it?
Why that book? One is because I always loved American history, and I like to write books about things that I care about. So that was one reason I wrote about history, because I love history. I don't think you should write about things that you don't care about. But the second reason is even more important in some ways. It was around that time that people started to talk about the fact that Americans, and especially American students, don't know much about history. And I couldn't understand that because history was always so interesting to me. And as I talked to people, I would always hear the same thing. Oh, history, it's so dull, it's so boring, it's just those dates and battles and speeches. And to me, history is anything but boring. It's about real people doing real things, and that's what I've tried to do in my books, is tell real stories of real people. I also write in a style that's a lot different from a lot of school books, because I write in a question and answer format, just like we're having this right now. I ask questions. Sometimes they're very simple, like, what does the Declaration of Independence declare? Or sometimes they're a little bit more offbeat and quirky, like, why is there a statue of Benedict Arnold's boot at Saratoga, New York? And those questions are just meant to capture our sense of curiosity about not only history but everything. And so I've gone on to write books about geography and the Bible and mythology, all these subjects that I care about a great deal, but are really about human curiosity, and that's what really gets us from one place to the next, is asking questions.
So what age did you realize that you were really into the history?
Well, this is the funny thing, that when I was writing a book recently, which is called Don't Know Much About the American Presidents, a history of all of the presidents and why we have a president, I found a book that I wrote when I was in the 3rd grade called My Project About Presidents. And so it was written truly 50 years ago. So I've been thinking and writing books about presidents and history for 50 years. So I mean, it truly was a 3rd grade project. But it's interesting because I could see even then I was interested in this stuff. And
so since the elementary school age, you were always interested in this?
I always was interested in history and in people, mostly about the people who are behind history, because it isn't just memorizing a date or a battle. It's really about what real people do in real places. And I always had that sense because when I was a kid, our parents would take us on camping trips, and we would go to places like Valley Forge and Gettysburg or Fort Ticonderoga in upstate New York, or to Old Sturbridge Village. And I always grew up with the sense that history is something that happens to real people in real places. And I've spent my career really trying to tell those kinds of stories about, and not just the famous people, the important people, the generals, the presidents, the George Washingtons and the Abraham Lincolns, but just sometimes it's about some of the common people who don't get into the history books that I'm interested in.
So if you weren't writing the history books, do you think you would be teaching about history?
That's a really good question, because I always thought I would become a teacher. Even when I was in high school and then into college, I thought, well, what am I going to do when I grow up? I thought I would be a teacher. And as much as I liked to read when I was a young person, and I was always a big reader, I remember being a kid and actually having a bunch of books in my bed. I always loved to read biographies and histories. I never had the sense that I could write a book. I never met a writer. when I was growing up. I didn't know any writers. Nobody ever visited my school as a writer. So I never really made the connection that behind every book there was a real person and that somebody could actually do that.
Yeah.
And it was only after I was really out in the professional world a little bit and working that somebody read some of the stuff that I had been writing when I was in college for a college newspaper and said, gee, you're a pretty good writer. You should try your hand at this. And so I did, and it worked out. So I've always had the idea that you should really do what you love and, focus on that as opposed to saying, oh, what am I going to do that, will make money for a career. I was very lucky. I found something I was very passionate about, and I was pretty good at it and have been able to make a professional career out of it and had fun doing it.
It's really cool.
Yeah. If you, let's say, when you were growing up and you said how you wanted to be a teacher when you were growing up, when you were younger, what did you envision as like the perfect classroom? Like if you were a teacher and you were up in front, what would a perfect classroom look like for you?
That's a interesting question because along with that third grade book I found, my mother had also kept an essay that I wrote when I was in fifth grade called What I Would Do If I Were a Teacher. And I remember, I didn't remember writing it, but I was amazed when I looked at it and I just said, the thing I would do would make my classroom more fun. So even when I was in fifth grade, I always had this idea that learning should be a lot more fun than it is for a lot of people. We all learn in different ways, and we all have.
Yeah.
I was one of those kids who fidgeted at my seat and looked at the clock at the wall, couldn't wait for the classroom to be over so I'd go outside. And I wasn't. I wasn't a bad student. It's just that I wasn't really a good student either, especially in elementary school. And I kind of coasted my way through high school. And it was really only in college that I really became much more interested in studying and working at it a little bit harder. But I've always had the idea that learning should be a lot more fun. And even with my books asking questions, I try and use humor. I try and use references to what's going on in pop culture and what's going on in our lives today, so that there's a real connection between the classroom and life to make it relevant. That was a big word when we were kids. This isn't relevant to me. Well, of course history is very relevant because everything that happened, whether it was 50 years ago or 150 years ago, has an impact on what's going on.
Yeah, that sounds like what we do with our P Day that we do in class. It's Passion Day. We have to relate our topic to the 19th century, and then we have to connect it to like real life today. So that lets us do basically what you're doing yourself.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I like to do, especially, and when I set out doing this, I wasn't thinking about classrooms and schools. I was really writing for people who just buy my books in bookstores. But I found a lot of teachers were using my books, and that's one of the reasons I'm here, that the teachers have gotten to know my books over the years and liked them, and a lot of them used them in classrooms. I've even had people tell me, and this is an amazing idea to me, that they became a history teacher because of my book, that I gave them a real interest
really
and excitement in history. So that's really an amazing idea, that something I do could influence what somebody else does with their life, but that's a different story. But the point that I was trying to make is that I go into a lot of classrooms now via Skype, and one of the things I do is really have, just the way we're talking right now about history, I talk to whole classrooms about it, and I really enjoy doing that. But I always make the point of connecting what was happening 150 years ago to what's going on today. And I'm always really interested in the idea, and I think that kids, especially kids your age, might be interested in, is the idea of what would life have been for me 150 years ago. And when you were, 150 years ago, we were in the middle of the Civil War. If you were 12 or 13 or 14, you were a boy, you might actually be going into the army, because boys that young were fighting in the Civil War. And if you were a girl at 12 or 13 or 14, chances are your fathers and brothers were leaving the farm and you were really in charge. So it's a completely different idea about, we look back and we think of wars and we see men fighting and they look like older men, but really it was a boys' war, and that meant a lot of young girls were also forced into a completely different situation, and girls were going to work in factories for the first time at that time.
Yeah.
Because most kids didn't go to school when you think about it 150 years ago or even 100 years ago. So that's something I always like to do, is really talk about what life would have been like for me at your age 100 years ago or 50 years ago. So it's a way to make history connect more to our lives.
Yeah, that's really cool.
Do you have a question?
I don't have any other questions.
I think.
The last question.
What's one question you wish we would have asked?
What's one question? Well, I'm glad you didn't ask me what my favorite color is, because that's such a boring question. Or
Yeah.
who, do I like Justin Bieber?
Yeah,
I don't want
to stay away from those
that's
type of questions.
No. What's one question that? I always like it when people ask me what my next book is, because that's we talk about the books that we've written, but we're also always thinking about the books we're going to write. And actually, I finished a book yesterday, so it's a very exciting time to ask that.
What book was it?
It's a book that won't be published for another year,
Okay.
so it'll come out probably in April of 2015, and it's a book that tells what I call the hidden history of 6 battles in American history. So it's kind of what it was really like to go to war from the Revolution right through to Iraq. And I'll tell that in 6 short stories about real people. Who goes to war? Why do they fight? Who fights for us? And so that's the next book in the series. It doesn't have a title yet, so I can't tell you what it is.
Okay, and then one last question. What recent event do you think would be overlooked and include in your books from 100 years from now?
What will
Or would be included in one of your books?
so what's something that's happening right now that will be included?
Will be or wouldn't be?
Yeah, I think that the most extraordinary change, if you look at a kind of bigger picture story, I think the most extraordinary change that I've witnessed in the past 10 years, and having watched American politics for a long time, is the sudden acceptance of same-sex marriage and the changed attitudes towards homosexuality in America. And I think 100 years from now, maybe people will look back and say, I can't believe that they thought that way back then. I mean, there might be that perspective that, wow, they were really fighting about this that back then. It seems so...
Yeah, because 100 years from now, that's probably going to be just like every normal day basis.
Right. A lot of people don't realize, for instance, that it's really only about 50 years ago that the law in America, that the laws about whites and blacks marrying changed. Before 1963, which isn't that long ago, I mean, that's in my lifetime, there were still laws that prohibited people of different races from marrying in this country. And it was a Supreme Court case that was brought by a young woman. She was only 18 years old at the time, named Mildred Loving. She brought the court case. She and her husband had been married in Washington, where it was legal, and they went into Virginia, and they were arrested. They were arrested because Virginia had laws that said whites and blacks couldn't marry.
Yeah, that's just weird to think, because I know my great aunt is married to a black man, and that's just so weird to think that they wouldn't be together if that law was still
well.
here
Yeah,
today.
and you think about, and it's also, of course, extraordinary. We do have an African American president, which I didn't think was going to happen for much longer, to be honest. But when he was born, his parents couldn't have gotten married in Virginia. So it's that's an extraordinary change in my lifetime, and we take it for granted now. But I think probably in 50 years, the same attitudes will probably express towards same-sex marriage. That what was the big deal?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like, why are we fighting over this if we know in 50 years from now it's going to be accepted and it's going to be the same thing with us not accepting black people?
The other thing that we can never know, of course, is that something might be happening today that we don't even know about that might be really important, whether it's something political or a war being fought somewhere. But maybe it's somewhere today somebody's making a discovery, or somebody's born today who will make a discovery that will truly change the world, like if the person who will really figure out cancer, for instance. Maybe that's happening somewhere, and that will probably be the most important thing that happens this year, but we won't know about it for a long time. So history has a way of surprising us about what's really important.
Yeah. Well, thank you for letting us interview you today.
Oh,
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
How has being an author affected your life and you as a person? How has it changed your life?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I'm not sure anybody's asked me that before, and I've answered a lot of questions, including on the Today Show and CNN. So you're very good interviewers, and I've been interviewed by some very well-known interviewers. So that's a good question. I can't say that it's changed me as a person. Because I think I'm kind of the same person. Obviously, it allowed me to have a career where I could really do the thing that I like to do, and I made a pretty good living out of it, which isn't true for a lot of writers. Writing is a difficult profession. Of course, there are people like Stephen King or J.K. Rowling who are billionaires because they've sold so many books, but most writers don't succeed that well financially. So it's a very difficult life. Most writers have to do something else while they write, so they teach or whatever else it is. But I've been lucky that I was able to write and raise a family and have a really nice satisfying life doing the thing that I love, and then getting to talk to people about it at places like this or going to bookstores. So I've been very, very lucky in that respect. I think that the idea of my books, that we have to ask questions and really question all of the basic things that we're told, is a really important idea that I remind myself of every day, because all the time we come across things where we find that ideas we've been told, or whether it's in medicine or science or politics or history, things that we are told that they tell us are very often either mistaken or untrue. And so it's very important to keep, not to become cynical, but just to become very, very questioning people who ask a lot of good questions and want to get at the truth, because the truth is really all that matters.
So is this what you're trying to help people get from your book, is ask questions? And
I think that I've always told people who read my books that they're just the beginning. If you're interested in this, here are 5 more books that you should read. That this should be the beginning of expanding your curiosity, not ending it. And that's what I've always hoped people take away from my books, is that it's part of a lifelong process. I really feel like I learn something new almost every day. In fact, I feel like if I haven't learned something new today, I've missed something.
So what have you learned today?
Well, so far nothing yet that I can think of, but there's still a long time to go. So.
Well, thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you. It was really a pleasure to talk to you, and I appreciate what you're doing, and I think it's a great opportunity. And like I said, when I was a kid, I'd never met a writer, and certainly, when you talk about what schools were like, we couldn't. It was really just the beginning of the television era. We didn't even have.
You guys don't have the computers in the classroom like we do today.
We didn't even have televisions in our classroom. To think about what school and it was pretty modern, and it was a brand new school, but it was just the dawning of the time when people were bringing. We had films. They would show movies occasionally in school, but the classroom has changed so completely, and I talk to a lot of teachers around the country, and I do the Skypes into classrooms to talk about how technology is really changing the classroom and how exciting that is, and the idea that textbooks might disappear in a few years, which I think they will, is a really it's a really I don't care about textbooks so much. I hope that people will still read my books for a few more years. But it's a really exciting time, but a challenging time, because there are also so many things attracting our attention. Those phones can be really, really dangerous temptation sometimes. I I use a cell phone, but only very rarely. I'm not a smartphone user, so I'm not technologically an idiot, but I'm just not really, that clued into it. But it's amazing to go around and see people just, fixed on their phones all the time.
Yeah.
But it's an amazing educational tool too. So,
Yeah, don't
Well,
worry,
thank
that's
you
me too.
so much.
well, it's my
Yeah.
pleasure, Maddie and Sarah, and I
Thank you
didn't get
so
to
much.
meet you,
Mike.
Michael. Pleased to meet you all, and good luck with your schoolwork. Are you on break now, or
No,
is this
next week.
just a day
Next
off?
week.